The boarding house stank of boiled cabbage and failure. And in the middle of it all, Mara knelt on the floorboards. Her world shrunk to the size of a scrub brush and a bucket of gray water. Every push of the brush was a prayer. Every pull was a curse. Boarders shuffled past, their boots scuffing the floor she just cleaned. They didn't see her. She was just part of the furniture, a kneeling ghost in a stained apron, her knees screaming, her hands raw from the lye soap. Two traveling salesmen, their shoes polished to a mirror shine, stepped wide around her slop bucket. One of them chuckled, a low, mean sound. Better she soaks the boards than wastes space in the parlor. The words hit her harder than a slap, but she didn't look up. She just bent lower, scrubbing the corner Mrs. Kettle had screeched about that morning. The landlady's voice was a permanent ringing in her ears. Rent by Saturday, Mara, or you're out on the street. No excuses. Widow or not, it made no difference. Mara had nodded, the fear in her belly a cold, coiled snake. What else could she do? She'd already pawned everything. Her wedding ring was long gone. The quilt her mother made was keeping some stranger warm. Even the silver comb, her only pretty thing, had been sold for a handful of coins that disappeared like dust. All she had left was the brush in her hand and the ache in her bones. As she wrung out the rag, she saw two small children peering down at her through the stair rails. Their eyes were wide with a pity so honest it felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the grimy water before their sympathy could shatter the last little piece of her pride. Then a shadow fell over her. It wasn't the short, round shadow of Mrs. Kettle. This one was tall, broad. Worn boots planted themselves near her bucket, steady and quiet. Mara risked a look up. It was Daniel Hale, the quiet cowboy from the second floor. He just stood there, his hat in his hands, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. He didn't speak. He just watched her dip the brush again, his silence more powerful than all the jeers and laughter combined. Mara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. Every stroke of the brush suddenly felt 10 times more humiliating, because he was watching, because he saw her. His hand moved to his coat pocket, his fingers fiddling with something inside. For a split second she saw it, a glint of silver, a coin, flashing in the dim hallway light before his fist closed around it, hiding it away. Her heart gave a stupid little jump. Hope was a dangerous thing, and the idea that a stranger's pity might save her made her feel even more ashamed. She turned her face away, focusing on the floor. Just then, Mrs. Kettle's heavy footsteps rattled the hall. Her skirt swished as she stormed in, a sneer already twisting her lips. "Work faster, girl. These boards won't shine themselves. And don't you think for a second that sweat counts as rent." Mara bit her lip, tasting blood. She scrubbed harder, her raw hands screaming in protest. Daniel's jaw tightened. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Defiance. Maybe anger. Before he turned on his heel and strode out the front door, his boots hammering against the porch boards. The door banged shut. The salesman at the dining table laughed again. He flicked a copper penny into her bucket. It landed with a plink, sending ripples of mockery across the dirty water. Mara's cheeks burned, but she didn't move. She just held her brush, her knuckles white. She could endure. She had to. One more day, one more insult, just to keep a roof over her head. As the hall fell quiet, she closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Let someone see more than a woman on her knees. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Daniel's room. Had he gone up there, or was he just standing outside waiting? She didn't know, and she didn't see him slip his hand back into his pocket, his fingers closing around that single silver coin, his last dollar, the one choice he had left. But neither of them knew, not yet, how much that one coin was about to cost them both. By morning, the ache was a fire in her shoulders, but Mara was on her feet when Mrs. Kettle came marching down the stairs. The landlady had her ledger tucked under her arm like a weapon, her spectacles perched on her nose like a hawk's talons. Her face was flushed, her voice a whip crack. "Mara Jennings!" she barked, slapping the ledger down on the front counter. She stabbed a crooked finger at the page. 2 weeks behind, rent. Today, or the door closes behind you. I run a business, not a charity. The dining room fell silent. Boarders looked up from their breakfast, their spoons hanging in midair. They were all watching, waiting. Mara clutched her apron, the words catching in her throat. "I'll work double, Mrs. Kettle. The stairs, the kitchen floors, all the linens. Just a little more time." The landlady let out a sniff. A smile stretched her lips, but it was thin and sharp and had no kindness in it. "Work won't pay the coal man, girl. You think sweat shines like silver? This house runs on cold, hard cash, not pity." From the table by the window, the two salesmen snickered. "Best let her scrub till her hands fall off," one of them whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still won't fill that ledger." Mara's throat closed up. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She bent her head, not willing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. And that's when Daniel appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, his shoulders tense under his worn coat. His eyes went from Mara to the ledger to Mrs. Kettle's smug face, and his jaw set like stone. He crossed the hall, his steps slow and deliberate. His boots made a steady, solid sound on the planks. "Give her a little grace," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence, and every single person in that room heard it. Mrs. Kettle snorted. "And who are you to tell me how to run my house? A cowboy with dust for pockets. You want to pay her rent? You go right ahead. Otherwise, you keep your tongue." The room held its breath. All eyes were on Daniel. His hand twitched, moving toward the coat pocket where his last silver dollar lay hidden. He could feel its ridged edge pressing against his palm, a cold reminder of how little stood between him and the street himself. He looked at Mara, kneeling there, her pride and her shame at war on her face. For a second, just a second, he almost did it. He almost pulled the coin out and threw it on the counter just to shut them all up. But he didn't. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. He turned toward the stairs. "Work ought to count for something," he muttered, his voice rough. Mrs. Kettle just rolled her eyes and snapped her ledger shut. The sound was like a jail door slamming. "By sundown, widow. Rent or the street." She swept away, leaving the hall to fill with whispers. Mara bent her head lower, scrubbing as if she could force the wood to bleed money. Her vision was a blur. The salesman tossed a crust of bread at her bucket. It floated in the gray water, a final, floating insult. On the stairs, Daniel paused. His knuckles were white where he gripped the banister. He almost turned back. He almost went down and placed the coin on the counter where it might save her. But he didn't. He kept climbing, each step heavier than the last. He knew the choice couldn't wait. Downstairs, Mara whispered it again, a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. One more day. Her eyes flicked up to the closed door of Daniel's room. Was he up there praying for the same thing? The coin in his pocket felt heavier than the whole world, and they both knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that by sundown it would demand an answer. The smell of stew and old smoke filled the boarding house. The dining hall was packed, boarders hunched over their bowls, their chatter loud and pointless until the moment Mrs. Kettle marched Mara into the room. Mara still had a dripping broom in her hand from her morning's work. The landlady carried her rent ledger like it was the word of God, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She slammed it down on the head table. The sound made every spoon in the room stop. "2 weeks past due," Mrs. Kettle announced, her voice ringing out. "And a widow's tears don't buy firewood. Unless this floor scrubber finds some coin by nightfall, she'll be sleeping in the street." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Some were pitying, most were cruel. A farmer at the corner table laughed. "Best let her scrub the porch, too. At least the street will be clean when she's tossed out." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly, like breaking glass. Mara just stood there, her head bowed. Her apron was soaked, her hands were raw, and the broom handle felt like it was fused to her fingers. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole, but Mrs. Kettle's hand was like a claw on her elbow, holding her up for everyone to see. "Beg them," the landlady hissed in her ear, her breath sour. "Maybe one of them will toss you a copper if you grovel." Mara's chest felt like it was on fire with humiliation, but her lips stayed pressed together in a thin, tight line. She had begged once before, that first long winter after her husband died. The memory still tasted like ash. She wouldn't do it again. Across the room, Daniel Hale sat at the end of a long table. He was just staring into his empty bowl, his hat in his lap, but his shoulders were coiled tight, like a rope about to snap. His eyes lifted and locked on Mara. He saw past the shame. He saw the battle she was fighting behind her silent eyes. His hand slid into his coat pocket. He felt the familiar ridged edge of the silver coin. It felt like both a promise and a curse. His jaw worked, and he could feel his own pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his fist clenched around it. He knew that once he let it go, it was gone forever. A boarder at the next table raised his cup in a mock toast. "What's the price of pity tonight, Mrs. Kettle? $1 buys her a bed? Half a dollar to let her keep scrubbing the stairs?" The laughter got louder, meaner. Mara's face went crimson. For the first time, her eyes flicked toward Daniel. There was a flash of pure desperation in them before she forced it down, looking back at the floor. She wouldn't ask him. She wouldn't ask anyone to waste their last scrap of hope on her. Mrs. Kettle thumped the ledger shut. The sound was as final as a nail being hammered into a coffin. "Sundown," she said again, her voice slicing through the noise. "Sundown or she's out. Let the whole town see how far scrubbing gets a woman with no man to claim her." She let go of Mara's arm, shoving her forward. Mara stumbled, and the broom fell from her hand, clattering on the floor. For a moment, there was total silence. The whole room watched her crouch down to pick it up, her pride bent even lower than her back. Daniel's hand tightened around the coin in his pocket until the sharp edge cut into his palm. A single drop of blood welled up. He pushed himself halfway out of his seat, the urge to stride across the room and end this whole ugly show burning in his chest. But he forced himself back down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Not yet, he told himself. Not while they were all so hungry for a spectacle. Mara straightened up, the broom back in her grip. Her eyes were hollow. She turned and walked out of the hall, the whispers following her like a pack of stray dogs. Daniel finally stood up, crushing the brim of his hat in his fist. He started walking toward the same door she'd just gone through, the coin in his pocket feeling as heavy as a gravestone. He knew the choice was coming, and when it did, he would not stand by and watch her crawl again. But what he didn't know was that the coin in his pocket was more than just his last dollar. It was a secret that was about to bring a whole world of trouble down on all of them. Daniel paced the floor of his tiny room under the eaves. The old boards creaked with every step he took, a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of his own heart. He rubbed the silver coin between his thumb and forefinger. Its ridged edge was smooth and worn, and now it was stained with a tiny, faint speck of his own dried blood. Outside the window, the sun was sinking low, painting the dusty street in shades of orange and red. But Daniel didn't see it. All he could see was Mara's face in the dining hall, burning with shame, while the laughter of cruel men circled her like wolves. He'd faced down cattle rustlers in the dead of night. He'd ridden through storms that could tear a fence post right out of the ground. He'd even buried his own brother in a field of rock and dust with his own two hands. And none of it, not one single bit of it, had ever made him feel as helpless as watching that woman be forced to scrub her dignity away for a room full of men who wouldn't spare her a single kind word. He set the coin down on the windowsill, staring at it as if it held some kind of answer. It was his last dollar. He'd saved it for months through hard work and thin meals. It was meant for winter seed or maybe a new pair of boots when the soles of his current ones finally gave out. He couldn't earn another one easily. The cattle drives were over for the season. Jobs were scarce and wages were low. But what good was a dollar saved if all it bought was his own comfort while he watched someone else starve? From downstairs, he could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of Mara's scrubbing. Scrape, swish, scrape. The sound grated on his nerves. He gritted his teeth. A sharp knock on his door made him jump. He opened it. It was Elbert, one of the salesmen, a smug grin on his face and a cigar clamped between his teeth. "Evening, Hale," Elbert said, blowing a cloud of smoke into the hallway. "They say the widow's out on her ear by nightfall. Might get interesting." He chuckled. "Shame to waste a good roof on her when there are stronger backs that need it." He winked, then strolled away down the hall, leaving the stink of his cigar behind him. Daniel's jaw hardened into a knot of solid muscle. He snatched the coin off the windowsill and shoved it back into his pocket. his hands curling into tight fists. He would not let her be thrown into the street while men like Elbert sat around drinking and sneering. He wouldn't. Downstairs, Mara wrung out her rag, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Mrs. Kettle swept past her, the ledger tucked under her arm. She paused just long enough to sneer. Don't go thinking that Cowboy's pity is going to save you. Men like him leave a lot quicker than debts do. Mara bit back the tears that threatened to spill. I'll find a way, she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely a breath. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Her fingers ached. The skin on her knuckles was split and bleeding. And still, the floor wasn't clean enough. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers searching for something. Anything. But it was empty. There was nothing left to sell, nothing left to pawn. She remembered her husband's old Bible, the one she'd sold for a few pennies that first winter after he died. A wave of shame so powerful it made her gag washed over her. She pressed her forehead against her knees, hiding her face from the world. Lord, she whispered, just one more day. And then she heard it, the sound of Daniel's boots on the stairs. Thud, thud, thud. Each step was slow, deliberate. Each step sounded like a vow. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes falling on her small, bent figure, her hands shaking as she clutched the wet rag. The low chatter from the dining room faded away as the boarders sensed that something was about to happen. Daniel's hand went to his pocket. He could feel the heat of the coin against his thigh. His voice was low, but it carried through the suddenly silent hall. Mrs. Kettle. The landlady turned, her eyebrows raised in annoyance. What now? He pulled the coin out of his pocket. He held it up. The silver glinted in the dim lamplight, and every eye in the room followed its shimmer. Her rent, he said, his voice steady. The room filled with a collective gasp. The boarders leaned forward, their faces a mixture of shock and excitement, but Daniel didn't move any closer. Not yet. He closed his fist around the coin again, his voice rough. If I must, he said, his gaze locked on Mrs. Kettle, I'll lay it down before sundown. Then he turned, without another word, and strode back up the stairs, leaving a thick, heavy silence in his wake. Mara stared after him, her breath caught in her throat. The rag fell from her limp fingers. For the first time since her husband died, she felt the ground beneath her shift. Not in ruin, but in the first, terrifying stirrings of hope, and a deep, cold fear of what that hope might ask of her. The sun was a sliver of gold on the horizon. Its last rays slanted through the boarding house windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The light fell across the wet floorboards, and it caught on the silver edge of a coin. Daniel had finally come back down. He stepped into the hall where Mara was still scrubbing, her body a tight knot of exhaustion. The other boarders were lounging in their chairs, pretending not to watch, but their ears were tuned to every sound, every breath. Mrs. Kettle stood behind the counter, her ledger open, her pencil held like a dagger, ready to strike. Time's just about up, she announced to the room, though her eyes were fixed on Mara. Rent unpaid means the street for you, girl. Mara flinched but kept her head down, dragging the wet rag over the wood. The shame was a fire in her throat, so hot she couldn't speak, couldn't even raise her eyes. The salesman Elbert chuckled from his table. Watch, he whispered to his companion. She'll crawl even lower yet. But then came the sound of Daniel's boots, steady, solid. Each step rang out like a hammer blow in the silent hall. He crossed the room, his hand in his pocket, his fingers wrapped tight around the coin. And in that moment, it felt like more than just silver. It was a choice. It was a judgment. It was the line between a woman's dignity and her ruin. He stopped right beside Mara. The whole room held its breath. All eyes were on the quiet cowboy, the stranger whose silence had suddenly become the loudest thing in the house. Mara dared to look up. Her gaze met his, and in his eyes she saw the storm he'd been fighting all day, all alone. Without a single word, Daniel opened his hand. He bent down, and he let the coin fall. It landed on the wet floorboards right next to her scrub brush. The clink of metal on wood was a small sound, but it echoed in the hall like a gunshot. It was so loud it even silenced Mrs. Kettle. Mara just stared at it. The coin gleamed up at her from a puddle of soapy water. the same coin he had hidden in his pocket for so long. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel's voice followed the sound, rough but certain. That pays her rent. A wave of gasps and whispers broke through the room. His last dollar, someone muttered. The salesman's smirk vanished. Mrs. Kettle's eyes narrowed, suspicion and greed warring on her face. A single coin? She snapped. For 2 weeks' room and board? Are you mocking me, Hale? Daniel's gaze hardened. His voice wasn't quiet anymore. It boomed through the hall. It is all I have, and it is more than the decency you've shown her. A man's last dollar weighs heavier than a miser's entire purse. Mara's hand trembled as she reached for the coin. Her fingers brushed against the cold, wet silver, and tears she hadn't let herself cry finally welled in her eyes. You shouldn't have, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. I won't watch you crawl while others laugh. The hall erupted. Some of the boarders were jeering, some were just staring in disbelief, all of them feeding on the drama. Mrs. Kettle slammed her ledger shut. There are rules, proper payment, she sputtered, but her face was turning red, and her voice had lost its edge. She could feel the eyes of every person in that room on her. Daniel didn't move. His boots were planted firm, his eyes locked on Mara, as if he was daring the world to try and shame her again. Mara closed her hand around the coin. The weight of it seemed to burn into her palm. It wasn't charity, it was a promise. The whispers around them started to change. The laughter was gone. The scorn was replaced by a grudging, unsettled respect. They had just seen something they couldn't easily mock. A man laying down everything he had for a woman on her knees. We'll see the sheriff about this, Mrs. Kettle blustered, but there was no real threat in it. Daniel finally turned, his hand just brushing the brim of his hat. You see who you will, he said. I've paid in full. He strode toward the stairs, and the crowd of boarders parted to let him pass. He left Mara kneeling in the soapy water, the rag limp in her hand, her breath coming in shuddering gasps. The silver coin blazed in her palm, a promise too powerful and too costly to ignore. But there was a detail only Daniel knew. That coin wasn't just his last dollar. It was a specially marked piece of silver, evidence in a federal case he'd been working for months. And by throwing it on the floor, he hadn't just saved Mara. He had just put them both in terrible danger. The next morning, the air in the boarding house was so thick with tension, you could have cut it with a knife. Every whisper, every sideways glance was about the night before. Mara stood by the wash basin, her hand in her apron pocket, clutching the silver coin. She hadn't let go of it all night. She hadn't slept either. Every creak of the old house was a reminder that Mrs. Kettle wasn't the kind of woman who gave up easily. A single act of defiance wouldn't just erase the lines in her ledger. Daniel came down the stairs slowly, his hat in his hand. There were dark shadows under his eyes. He'd had a restless night, too. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and met her gaze. No words passed between them, but the silence was filled with everything that hadn't been said. Before either of them could speak, a loud, heavy knock rattled the front door. Mrs. Kettle swept past them, her skirts snapping with self-importance. She yanked the door open. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Hollis, his badge gleaming on his chest, his jaw set like granite. The sheriff took off his hat, his sharp eyes cutting from Mara to Daniel, and then back again. I hear a man threw down his last dollar and called it rent, he said, his voice even and calm. And now the whole town's asking if the law is going to let sentiment rewrite the books. Mrs. Kettle sniffed, a triumphant little smile playing on her lips. She waved her ledger in the air like a flag. That's right, Sheriff. I keep an orderly house. I go by the rules, not by pity. If you let this stand, every stray and beggar in the county will be hiding behind a sob story and some fool's last coin. A murmur of agreement went through the boarders who had gathered in the hall, hungry for the next scene in the drama. Mara's face burned with shame. She had done nothing wrong, nothing but work and endure. And still, she was the one being put on trial. Daniel stepped forward. His shoulders were squared, his voice rough but steady. It was my dollar, the last one I had, and it's worth more than all their jeers put together. I'll not let it be mocked. The sheriff studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly. Last dollar or not, Hale, The rules don't bend easy. A woman's rent is paid in coin, not sentiment. If you mean to keep her under this roof, you better find a way to make it proper, or the tongues in this town will tear you both to pieces. Mara's chest tightened. Her fingers clenched around the coin in her pocket. She wanted to shout that she hadn't asked for this, that she hadn't asked for his help. But the words were stuck in her throat, torn between her stubborn pride and a wave of gratitude that threatened to drown her. "This is it as." Kettle smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "You hear that? Proper payment, or she's in the street, by sundown. Again." The sheriff's gaze flicked back to Mara. It seemed a little softer now, but his voice was still stern. "By sundown," he repeated, nodding once. Then he turned to Daniel, his voice dropping to a low warning. "And don't think one brave act makes you a hero. This town is watching, and they don't forgive weakness." With that, he put his hat back on his head and strode out, his boots thudding heavily on the porch. The door shut, leaving a silence that was as thick as smoke. Mara could feel every eye in the room burning into her. The boarders were already whispering. Daniel turned to her, his voice quiet. "I meant it, Mara. That coin is yours now. Let them talk." She shook her head, tears finally brimming in her eyes. Her voice broke. "It was too much. You've left yourself with nothing." He met her gaze, and his was unwavering. "Better me with nothing than you with nothing, and there's shame to carry besides." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The whispers of the boarders faded as they slowly drifted back to their breakfast tables. But Mrs. Kettle lingered, her lips curled in a nasty smile. "We'll see what you pay with come sundown," she hissed before retreating to her office, clutching her ledger like a weapon. Mara's knees felt weak, but she stood a little straighter than she had the night before. The coin in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. She knew now that this wasn't just a fight for a roof over her head. It was a fight for her dignity in front of the whole town. And with every tick of the clock bringing sundown closer, the weight of that single silver dollar grew, demanding a final reckoning that no prayer could postpone. And no one, least of all Mara, saw the quick, almost invisible signal that passed between Daniel and the sheriff. It was a small gesture, a slight dip of the head, a flick of the eyes. But it meant one thing: the plan was still on, and the stakes were higher than ever. By the afternoon, the boarding house felt less like a home and more like a theater. Every boarder was just waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of a play that Mara wished she could run away from. The dining room was filled with the sound of clinking spoons and forced laughter, but underneath it all was a low hum of anticipation. Every time she passed with her bucket and brush, eyes followed her, and whispers trailed behind her like ghosts. Daniel sat in a chair by the window, his hat in his lap, his gaze fixed on the street outside. But the muscles in his jaw were bunched so tightly they looked like they might snap. He was a storm waiting to break. Finally, Mrs. Kettle swept into the room. She had her ledger under her arm and her spectacles perched on her nose, and she was wearing a smile as sharp as a freshly honed knife. She had already tasted victory. She laid the ledger flat on the front desk, tapping the page where Mara's name was written in neat, unforgiving ink. "By sundown," she announced to the assembled boarders, "we settle this nonsense. A dollar might buy you some sympathy, but rent requires a good deal more than that." The room chuckled. Mara felt a hot flush creep up her throat. She bent lower over her brush, her knuckles raw and bleeding. Each stroke of the bristles across the splintered wood felt like she was dragging her own dignity through the dirt. At their usual table, the salesman Elbert snickered. "Maybe she'll sing for her supper next, eh?" he called out. The laughter that followed was loud and cruel. And that's when Daniel stood up. His chair scraped across the floorboards with a sound so harsh it silenced the entire room. He walked to the counter. The silver coin was clutched in his fist. He laid it down on the open ledger. The sound of the metal hitting the book cracked the air. There were gasps from around the room as the boarders craned their necks to get a better look. Daniel's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Her rent. Paid." Mrs. Kettle's nostrils flared. She poked at the coin with the tip of her pencil, as if she thought it might be hot. "One coin for 2 weeks, board and all? You're insulting me, Hale." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire. It is all I have, my last, and it's worth more than all of your smug laughter, and twice the dignity of anyone in this room." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the boarders started to look uncomfortable. Mara froze. Her brush slipped from her numb fingers and fell into the bucket with a splash. She rose slowly to her feet, her apron dripping, her eyes wide. She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to beg him not to throw away his future for the sake of her shame. But the words died in her throat when she saw the look on his face. "Mrs." Kettle pursed her lips, then raised her voice so everyone could hear. "The sheriff will decide this. I won't mark this book until the law says I have to, and if he rules that this is false payment, then both of you can take your precious pride and sleep in the street with it." The boarders gasped, thrilled by the promise of an even bigger spectacle. The whispers grew louder, surging like a tide. But Daniel stood his ground, his voice steady and calm. "Then let the sheriff come. I'll stand by what I've given." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She was torn between a desperate hope and an equally desperate despair. She took a step forward until she was standing at his side. Her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his coat, as if she was drawn to him by a force stronger than her own fear. The whispers rippled again, but this time, not all of them were cruel. Some were tinged with surprise at her sudden boldness. Mrs. Kettle snapped her ledger shut and retreated from the counter with a huff. But the damage had been done. Every single person in that room had seen a man stake his last coin, everything he had in the world, on a widow's dignity. The salesmen weren't laughing anymore. Their smirks looked brittle and fake in the heavy silence. Mara swallowed hard. "You should not have," she whispered, her words for him alone. Daniel glanced down at her. His jaw softened, but his eyes were still fierce. "I could not do otherwise." Outside, a shadow fell across the window pane. Sheriff Hollis was striding up the porch steps. The room held its breath. The final judgment was about to be written. Not in ink, but in a choice that would change everything. Because Elbert the salesman was watching Daniel's face, and a slow, ugly smile of recognition was starting to spread across his own. He knew that coin. The heavy oak door groaned open, and Sheriff Hollis stepped inside. His boots were loud on the floorboards, each step a pronouncement of his authority. His eyes swept over the crowded hall, taking in the spectacle. The boarders pressed close, hungry for a show. Mrs. Kettle clutching her ledger like it was a holy book. And Daniel, standing firm by the counter, with Mar at his side, her apron still damp and her hands trembling. The sheriff's voice cut through the whispers like a saw through green wood. "I hear tell a man laid down his last coin to cover a widow's rent, and a house full of wagging tongues says it ain't proper." Mrs. Kettle puffed out her chest. She snapped the ledger open on the counter and stabbed her pencil at Mara's name. "See for yourself, Sheriff. Weeks behind. One single coin against a debt owed. It's a mockery of order." Whispers swirled through the room. A few of the boarders nodded in agreement. Others just shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Daniel's gaze. The sheriff's eyes moved to Daniel. "Is that true, Hale? You paid her rent with your last dollar." Daniel held his gaze, his own eyes steady and clear. The silver coin glinted on the page between them. "True enough, it was my last, and it bought her dignity back from a room full of laughter." Seems like a fair trade to me. A few more murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some were surprised, some were still scoffing. But from his table, Albert the salesman was watching with a new intense focus. He wasn't just enjoying the show anymore. He was studying Daniel, studying the coin. Sheriff Hollis's brow furrowed. The lines on his face were those of a man who was tired of judging his fellow men, but knew it was his job to do it anyway. "Dignity doesn't fill ledgers, Hale. You know that. The law keeps order, and order is what keeps roofs over people's heads." Mara's breath caught in her throat. The shame was a physical weight, threatening to crush her. But then something inside her snapped. She stepped forward, her voice raw and shaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sheriff, I have scrubbed these floors until my hands bled. Every penny I have ever earned in this house has gone to pay my rent. If the law can't see that a woman's sweat is worth something, Then what is left for people like me? Gasps fluttered through the room. Mara had never raised her voice before. The sheriff blinked, clearly taken aback by her sudden fire. He looked at her, then at Daniel, then at the eager, hungry faces of the crowd. The weight of their judgment seemed to press down on him. Slowly he reached for the coin. He picked it up, turning it over and over in his calloused palm. The silver glinted in the lamplight. Then he held it up, his voice ringing through the hall. $1, the last this man has, given not for himself, but for another's shelter. I'll weigh that heavier than a whole purse full of coppers tossed for mockery. The room erupted. Some people gasped in outrage. Others started to clap, a soft, hesitant applause. Mrs. Kettle sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. "Sheriff, you can't!" But he raised his hand and she fell silent. "I can. The rent is marked paid." With a slow, deliberate motion, he set the coin back down on the ledger. He took out his own pencil, and he drew a thick, dark line through Mara's debt. The scratch of the graphite on the paper was louder than any of the whispers. The room was stunned into silence. Daniel let out a slow breath, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. Mara's eyes flooded with tears of relief and disbelief. Mrs. Kettle slammed the ledger shut, glaring at them both. "Fine," she snarled, "but when next week comes, she'll find no grace in this house." She swept out of the hall, her skirts snapping like banners of defeat. The sheriff put his hat back on, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "You've bought her 1 week, Hale. Make it count. This town won't forget this quickly." He turned and strode out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Daniel stood tall beside Mara. The coin was now legally hers, but it no longer belonged in his pocket. The boarders started murmuring again, some of them looking at Daniel with a new respect, others still muttering about what a fool he was. Mara pressed a trembling hand over her apron pocket, as if the coin was already safely inside. "You gave away everything you had," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Daniel looked down at her, his voice low. "Everything I had was nothing, until I gave it away." And as the crowd started to disperse, a new, far more dangerous scene was beginning. Elbert the salesman slipped out the back door. He knew that coin. He knew the tiny, almost invisible mark on the eagle's wing. It was one of his. It was counterfeit. And the man who called himself Daniel Hale had just paid a debt with it in front of the town sheriff, which meant one of two things. Either Hale was a fool or he was a lawman, and Elbert was going to find out which. For the next few days, an uneasy peace settled over the boarding house. The whispers about Mara and Daniel didn't stop, but they were softer now, laced with a grudging respect. Mrs. Kettle avoided them both, her face a permanent mask of sour disapproval. She carried her ledger like it was a wounded animal, snapping it shut whenever Mara walked past. The humiliation of being overruled by the sheriff in her own house had bruised her pride far more than her purse. Daniel was as quiet as ever, but now people watched him. They saw the worn soles of his boots and the fact that he nursed a single cup of coffee all morning. They knew he was broke. Some thought he was a fool. Others saw a quiet courage they couldn't quite understand. But for Mara, everything had changed. The shame was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative pride. She still scrubbed the floors, but now she held her head high. She met the stares of the other boarders without flinching. The silver coin was her secret treasure. She kept it wrapped in a small piece of clean linen, tucked safely inside an old Bible that Daniel had pressed into her hands the morning after the sheriff's visit. "Keep it safe," he had said, his voice low. "It's worth more now than when it was in my pocket." She had just nodded, a lump in her throat making it impossible to speak. Every night in the privacy of her small room, she would unwrap it. She would run her fingers over the ridged edge, remembering the sharp, clear sound it made when it hit the ledger. The sound that had silenced a room full of mockery. The coin was more than just money now. It was a promise, a testament to the moment her dignity had been bought back, not with wealth, but with a sacrifice that had humbled a room full of cynics. But while Mara was cherishing her newfound peace, Daniel was living on a razor's edge. He knew Albert was watching him. The salesman's eyes followed him everywhere. He would try to strike up casual conversations, his questions light and friendly, but always probing, always digging. "Haven't seen you around these parts before, Hale. What line of work you in?" Just passing through, Daniel would reply, his answers always vague. Looking for whatever work I can find. He knew he was in a dangerous game. His cover was blown, at least to Elbert. The counterfeit coin had been a calculated risk, a desperate move to save Mara that had now compromised his entire mission. Sheriff Hollis had warned him. You've painted a target on your own back, Daniel, and on hers. Now every quiet moment was filled with a gnawing tension. Every time Elbert looked at Mara, a cold fury rose in Daniel's chest. He had saved her from public humiliation, only to drag her into the center of a federal investigation. One evening, Mara found him sitting alone by the fire in the parlor. The Bible was open on her lap, the silver coin glinting in the firelight between the worn pages. You could have kept it, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet awe. For seed, for boots, for yourself. He looked up from the flames, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than just being broke. He shook his head. I had no need that was greater than yours. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. $1 is only worth what you spend it on, Mara. I chose to spend it on you. Tears blurred her vision, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of shame. She closed the Bible, pressing it to her chest, the coin sealed safely inside. Daniel got up and walked over to the fireplace, his shadow stretching across the very floorboard she had scrubbed so many times. And for the first time, Mara didn't see herself as the widow on her knees. She saw a woman standing on ground that had been bought and paid for with courage. Then let it be the first coin of a new account, she said, her voice trembling but sure. Not of debt, but of hope. A faint smile touched his lips, and he nodded. The fire crackled between them, a warm and steady sound. But outside, the prairie wind was rattling the shutters, and a different kind of storm was gathering. Elbert had spent the last few days sending telegrams, and he had just gotten a reply. The name Daniel Hale was an alias. The man's real name was Daniel Travin, a U.S. Marshal. And now Elbert knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't just going to get his counterfeit coin back. He was going to eliminate the lawman who had come to hunt him down. And the widow was going to be his bait. The fragile peace shattered on a Saturday night. The dining hall was crowded again, the boarders eating their supper, the air thick with the usual low chatter. Suddenly, Mrs. Kettle strode to the center of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with a frantic, theatrical panic. "My cash box!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the front desk. "It's been broken into! The money is gone!" The room erupted into chaos. Boarders jumped to their feet, shouting questions. In the midst of the confusion, Elbert the salesman stepped forward, his face a mask of solemn concern. Now, let's all calm down," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Mrs. Kettle, did you see who did it?" "No," she wailed, "but it must have been someone in this house. A thief." Elbert's eyes, full of false sympathy, swept the room. They landed on Mara, who was standing by the kitchen door, frozen in shock. "Well," Elbert said slowly, thoughtfully, "there is one person here who has been in desperate need of money." Every head in the room turned to look at Mara. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't just curious. They were ugly, accusatory. "That's ridiculous!" A voice cut through the noise. It was Daniel. He pushed his way through the crowd to stand in front of Mara, his body a shield between her and the suspicious glares. "She wouldn't steal a thing." "Oh, really?" Elbert said with a sneer. "And how would you know, Hale? You, the man who paid her rent with his last dollar. A very noble gesture. Or was it?" He let the question hang in the air. "Perhaps you two are in this together. She distracts everyone with her sob story, while you help yourself to the cash box." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. The accusation made a twisted kind of sense. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew this was a trap. Elbert was trying to force his hand. "That's a lie," Daniel said, his voice a low growl. "Mrs. Kettle, you should call the sheriff." "I will," she shrieked, "and he can search everyone's rooms, starting with hers." The crowd surged forward, their faces a mixture of excitement and suspicion. They were a mob in the making. Mara shrank back against the wall, her face ashen. This was a nightmare. Worse than the shame, worse than the poverty. Now they thought she was a thief. Daniel knew he was out of time. His mission, his cover, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was protecting Mara. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice suddenly calm and filled with an authority that made everyone pause. He reached inside his coat, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open. Inside, pinned to the leather, was a silver badge, a United States Marshal's badge. The room went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The boarders stared, their mouths hanging open. Mrs. Kettle's shrieking stopped abruptly. "My name is Daniel Travin," he said, his eyes locked on Albert. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and you, Albert, are under arrest for the manufacturing and distribution of counterfeit currency." Albert's face went white. The mask of the friendly salesman dropped away, replaced by the cornered snarl of a rat. He lunged, not at Daniel, but at Mara. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him, and pressed the cold, hard barrel of a derringer to her temple. "You're not taking me anywhere, lawman," he hissed. "You drop your gun, or the widow dies right here." Mara cried out, a small, terrified sound. The boarders scrambled back, knocking over chairs in their haste to get away. The room was suddenly a chaotic mess of overturned tables and terrified faces. Daniel stood his ground, his hands still inside his coat. He hadn't drawn his weapon yet. His eyes were fixed on Albert, his face unreadable. "Let her go, Albert. It's over." "It's not over till I say it is," Albert screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Now drop the gun." But Daniel hadn't moved. He was looking past Albert, at something behind him, and that's when a new voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. "I don't think so." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, a Colt peacemaker held steady in his hand, was Sheriff Hollis. He hadn't been called. He'd been waiting outside the whole time. Albert was trapped. His eyes darted back and forth between Daniel and the sheriff. For a split second, his grip on Mara loosened. And that was all the time Daniel needed. He moved like a lightning strike. In one fluid motion, he drew his own pistol, sidestepped, and brought the heavy barrel down hard on Albert's wrist. The derringer clattered to the floor. Albert howled in pain, and Daniel shoved Mara safely behind him, leveling his gun at the counterfeiter's chest. It was over. Sheriff Hollis moved in, clapping irons on Albert's wrists. The salesman was defeated, his face a mess of sweat and fury. As the sheriff started to lead him away, Albert looked back at Mrs. Kettle, his eyes full of venom. "You were supposed to help me," he spat. "You knew who he was. We had a deal." The room went silent again. All eyes turned to the landlady. Mrs. Kettle's face crumpled. She had been in on it. The break-in was a setup, a ploy to discredit Mara and help Albert get to Daniel. He said he knew my husband," she stammered, tears of self-pity streaming down her face. "He said my husband was a partner of his, that he was cheated. He promised me a share." The sheriff just shook his head in disgust. "You can tell the rest of your story to the circuit judge, ma'am. You're under arrest, too. Accomplice to a federal fugitive." As Mrs. Kettle was led away sobbing, the room was left in a state of stunned silence. The boarders just stared, trying to process the dizzying series of reveals. Daniel holstered his pistol, his shoulders slumping slightly with relief. He turned to Mara. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but she was safe. She was looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. The quiet cowboy, the man with dust for pockets, was a lawman. The man who had saved her dignity had just saved her life. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small linen-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped the silver coin. "This," she said, her voice trembling. "It's evidence, isn't it?" He nodded. It was. It was part of a counterfeit batch we'd been tracking for months. Albert's handiwork. Throwing it down like that, it was a risk, but it was the only thing I could think of to do. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, unspoken emotion. "I couldn't let them break you, Mara." The coin lay in her palm, glinting in the lamplight. It had been so many things. A man's last dollar, a symbol of hope, a federal crime, a catalyst for chaos. And now it was just a piece of metal again. But what it had bought was real. It had bought her freedom. The boarding house was sold at a public auction a few months later. With the reward money she received for her role in the capture of a federal fugitive, Mara was the highest bidder. The whispers about her stopped. Now, when people in town spoke of the widow Jennings, they spoke with respect. Daniel Travin's mission was over, but he didn't leave. He stayed, trading his marshal's badge for the quiet life he'd never realized he wanted. The silver dollar, no longer needed as evidence, was framed and hung over the fireplace in the parlor. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest value a dollar can have is when you give it away, and a reminder that dignity, once purchased with courage, can never be stolen again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of justice and redemption from the Old West. And let us know in the comments, if you had only $1 left to your name, would you keep it for yourself, or would you spend it to save another person's dignity?